And there we go. Another Trumpowski. Hikaru played that yesterday and was not very successful with it. He had a bad position. But I suppose he's improved. Queen to b6 by MVL, attacking the pawn straight away. In the previous game, Hikaru did something like Queen d2. Obviously, this would lose in this position. All right. Hikaru must win. So he's lost the first game of the tiebreak. He has to win this game or he loses the match to MVL, which would be... Okay. So they're just developing their pieces. Knight to h4. Hikaru going after MVL's light-squared bishop. Bishop g6 is a typical response here to make sure that the h-file is opened up. Bishop to e4 first. The key for MVL, he wants to trade the bishop on his own terms. So if white takes, then at least MVL gets his knight to a good square. And by the way, something like this could happen. So Hikaru going a4, going on the other side of the board. He's going to try to expand his control over the queen side. MVL stops him in his tracks. Hikaru could, well, not entirely. Hikaru could also push the pawn to a5. Why is he choosing the Trumpowski? Because it's a pretty unbalanced opening. It guarantees an interesting position. And he strays away from MVL's field of expertise. The Najdorf, the Grunfelds. He doesn't want to get caught up in some sort of preparation, which is completely understandable. Yeah, Trumpowski is not as theoretical of an opening. First of all, every opening now is theoretical, but the Trumpowski is not as theoretical as some of the other ones. Carlsen, Geary, by the way. Geary playing the Sicilian. Carlsen going c3, very solid opening. The c3 Sicilian. If Geary manages to win this game with black, I will be beyond impressed, honestly. So we're not anticipating that. So we are watching 3 games simultaneously. Carlsen, Geary, the game 4, which if Carlsen does not lose, then he wins the matchup. We are going to start watching Wesley against Rajabov. Sorry, 5 games. And we're going to be watching also, of course, Nepo against Aronian. Neither of those games have started, so let's continue watching MVL against Hikaru. And we have an opposite colored bishop position, where Hikaru has managed to introduce a defect into MVL's pawn structure. But this pawn on e4 is both a strength and a weakness, because look at the pawn on e4. It is limiting the knight on h4 from getting back into the game. I like what MVL is doing here. Very solid position. Chuck. 33, 44, 55. Thank you for the sub. Happy Thanksgiving to you too. Is g5 a move? It is. But then the knight's going to dip back to g2, and you've got to be very careful about weakening your king side. MVL trading, going knight to d5. Notice that if the queen takes on e4, MVL has hooked himself to that pawn on b2. This is a great idea by MVL. And if knight g2, he can go f5 and defend his pawn with another pawn. That's the most reliable way of defending. Let's see what Hikaru does here. He does go knight g2. He couldn't allow bishop takes h4, f5. Has happened. Okay. Queen b1. Queen b3. MVL expanding his control over the position. Bishop g5. a5. But what about knight b4? Ladies and gentlemen, what about knight b4? Doesn't this trap the rook? If you take the knight, I take the rook. He's done it. Knight b4 by MVL. This is a disaster for Hikaru. His rook has nowhere to go. And if you take, then queen takes c2. And the rook is lost. Oh, my lands. And he's given up the exchange. This is a losing position for Hikaru out of the opening. And MVL has to only not lose. He can draw. It's not over. It's never over. Hikaru, we know how he defends. But now, the simple knight d3 forces more trades. Because if you take, I take. And again, as soon as the queen leaves b1, black takes b2. So MVL with a critical position here. He's got to capitalize on this. But knight d3, I think, is the simplest way to force further trades. And he's gone knight d5. So he's gone back to d5. This is also fine, obviously. Jam with 5 gifted to the community. Holy smokes, here he comes. Here comes the man himself. Thank you, Jam. Really appreciate it. All right. So, f3 by Hikaru. He's trying to open up the position. He's trying to create some chances. Hikaru has to not only not lose this, but he's got to win this. That's what makes this so incredibly difficult. MVL is up in exchange for no compensation. He drops his queen back to b5. Going after this pawn. Of course, c4 not possible. You just take the pawn. Rook to e1 by Hikaru. Doing a good job opening up the e-file. Doing what he can. The move rook d6, though, seems very likely here. And it looks like black is more than fine here. He's still winning. And MVL has to manage the fact that he can draw this game. Let me refresh the board to see if the clocks start ticking. I know that's annoying. Yes, okay, we're good. Now the clocks are ticking. Rook to queen a2 by Hikaru. He's building up a time advantage, threatening rook takes a6. This is not over yet. We all know that Hikaru is more than capable of climbing back in these types of positions. And I think MVL is beginning to let this one slip. King to h8. But now, bishop h5 is possible. And knight h4, Hikaru starts getting his pieces out. After winning the exchange, MVL starting to let this one go. Bishop h5, rook f8, rook e6. I mean, king h8 just seems very superficial. And there comes bishop h5. Hikaru's not going to give you 2 chances. Maybe what MVL needs to do, and rook e7, he's blundered knight h4. Now MVL is worse. This is unreal. This is horrible play by MVL, but incredibly amazing resistance by Hikaru, who now has bishop g6 and bishop f5. Not to take anything away from Nakamura, he's missed it. Knight g6. Ooh, that would have been a big chance. Bishop g6, ladies and gentlemen. And if king g8, bishop takes f5, if you notice this pin, I think he had this. And now this is a big breath of fresh air for MVL, although he again gives up f6, but he wants knight f6 there. I don't know what's going on here. Rook e6, knight f6, I guess, is the idea. One second. Okay, one sec. Knight e5. No. Hikaru decides not to take the pawn. Instead, he goes to f5. Now, if I were MVL, I would try to move this king away from the line of fire of the bishop. The other thing that's important to point out here is if c4, you can just sack on c4, or you can go queen b4, counter-attacking the rook. So c4 isn't strictly speaking a threat. MVL has done it. King to g8. Well, I'm into this, so let's see what happens. I think MVL doing a really good job of protecting this. Hikaru had a big chance there that he missed. If my calculation wrong, again, I'm not using the computer. I'm just looking at it from my own end. I don't know what's going on here. This is a very complex position. Hikaru's obviously sinking his knight on g6. Now, how does MVL play this? Does he try to protect this pawn? Does he try to go for active defense? He goes back to h7. His idea, if you take on e6, MVL goes knight f6, intercepting the rook's defense over the knight. And if the bishop moves, obviously king takes g6. But bishop e2 is possible. I think that might be a key detail that we'll see if one of them spots this. I don't know if that's even good for white or not. I'm getting all the right moves. Okay, great. So rook takes e6 is what's coming to my mind. Knight f6, bishop e2. And then you could have an endgame of this kind, where, yes, white is down in exchange, but he's got a pawn, and he's got a massive pawn structure here. So Hikaru definitely contemplating rook takes e6 here. I can guarantee you that's what he's calculating. Will he play the move? I don't see an alternative. I just don't see what else he can do other than rook takes e6, and he has done it. So what we're going to see now, my guess, is knight f6, bishop e2 is forced. I'm pretty sure. Bishop e2 seems absolutely forced. And then it's up to MVL. Does he trade queens? Does he move his queen? Bishop e2 happens. Queen d5 seems to be the most natural. It's happened. Takes on d5, takes on d5. And knight e5. So exactly as we anticipated. Knight to h4, by the way, also very interesting. You could... Okay, bishop... Oh, you don't even have to move the knight. So bishop d3, rook f7, defending the pawn. Knight e5 comes to mind. Chasing the rook away. White is definitely calling the shots now. An incredible comeback by Hikaru. An incredible comeback by Hikaru. Now, how do we make sense of this position? Let's count the pawns. 5 pawns for black and 6 pawns for white. So white's got a pawn for the exchange. But if you look at the actual placement of the pieces, white's got massive initiative here. Attacking f5, attacking the knight. He's pushing black's pieces around. None of them are defended. And if you go knight e7, you walk into rook d7, forking the knight and the pawn. So knight e3, MVL trying to scramble. You don't want to go king f2 here because the knight can then win the pawn on b2. That's something you got to watch out for. But Hikaru just says, okay, let's leave that knight stranded and let's go after black's queenside pawns. I think black is losing here. And this is an insane turnaround from Hikaru and MVL. MVL with a winning position out of the opening. Rook d6. Okay. I wonder what's behind that move. I guess knight d7 is a potential threat here. That's not really a threat. Is that rook on d6? Okay, MVL going back to c8. MVL wants to go knight to d1. His only active idea, I think, is to somehow go after these pawns. Okay, now rook king f2. Why did Hikaru put a rook on b6? So that knight d1 no longer wins the pawn on b2. Now MVL is going to have to drop it back to d5 and back to e7. That's exactly what's happened. And Hikaru could add the Tabasco sauce at any moment with g4. He adds it with knight d7. If you go rook d8, you walk into a discovery. I think this knight is relocating. It's relocating from e5 to c5. And that's going to put the damper on any attempts. That's what he does. The rook on c7 now can't move, right? Because the knight is contesting and attacking the pawn on b7. MVL trying to shift around his pieces. He's trying to find the best defensive posture, but Hikaru can go b4. He can pull the net on black's pieces. Yep, g6 by MVL, trying to buttress the pawn on f5. And this is, I don't know. I mean, Hikaru with 45 seconds, which is not a lot of time in a position like this. Here's the problem. The computer might say white's better. But from a practical perspective, as Hikaru trying to undermine black's pawns, does MVL go h5? But then knight e6. MVL scrambling, keeping his pieces defended. Hikaru's going to have to choose a moment to quote-unquote go for it. And he just did, and he's going for it in a big way. But knight e6, there's rook takes c4. Maybe you drop the bishop back to b3. Maybe you play bishop b3 or even bishop a2 to prepare the move knight e6. But it's a little bit slow. MVL is also a beast at defending these positions. Yep, that's what he does. Now here's the thing. If you go knight e6, then MVL can still capture on c3, and he can counterattack the bishop. So knight e6 isn't really a threat. Question is, what does MVL do? g5 comes to mind, but then h5 continuing to bang in those nails into black's coffin. Rook to d7 now seems pretty automatic. Don't take on b7 because you give up the knight on c3. Hikaru under 30 seconds, he's going to have to make a move. This is going to be very hard to win with almost no time on the clock. My guess is rook d7 has to be played. He does. What does MVL do now? Does he move his knight away? Does he play knight to g8? Knight to c8. Okay. This is a must-win. Bishop to d5. And Hikaru going now after black's pawns. And knight e6, and he's going to win. And a fork delivered to MVL's rook. And MVL has resigned. What a comeback by Hikaru. Incredible. Unbelievable. And just absolutely insane. The fact not only that he didn't lose the position after knight b4, but the fact that he won it. And it seemed like the turnaround occurred within the scope of 4 or 5 moves. And I honestly can't believe that MVL did not play knight d3 in this position. This seemed like an automatic kind of move, which would have greatly reduced white's chances to win the game because it would have forced him to give up his bishop. And now they go on to their Armageddon. They go to Armageddon. And in the meantime, Aronian and Nepal playing their first game of the Blitz playoff. Carlsen and Geary. Geary has succeeded in making this crazy. But who is it crazy for? I think black is just worse. So this is incredible. And Hikaru is definitely the favorite in the Armageddon. An unbelievable turnaround. And yeah, we all know how he can defend. But MVL definitely with a golden opportunity there to put the match away. Wow. So definitely something that is going to haunt him tonight. We'll try to stay for the interesting action. Carlsen is definitely better. I don't think he's going to lose this position. And Gary, again, has to win to carry this through to the Blitz playoffs. So we'll see. MBL and Nakamura are on their way. Buckle up, seatbelts fastened in. Mandatory, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. Here we go. And another one of these Italians. We've seen this opening in every one of their white games. And they're playing so fast. That's just how the transmission is. They're repeating the line from what they just had. I wonder if they both looked up this line and whose preparation was better. Generally, in these positions, white's better. Because white's got a freer position. He's got control of a lot of key squares. And I'm going to disable the alerts temporarily. And he's attacking the rook. So Hikaru now with a key dilemma. He goes knight b4. Now MBL shifts his knight over to d4. That blockading square we've talked about many times. Okay. Hikaru needs a draw to win. The rules of the Armageddon. White, as you can see, white has 5 minutes, black has 4 minutes. But a draw is a win for black. Obviously, that's the odds. And now rook c8. I don't know. Yeah, looks like Hikaru's got a great position here. Maybe queen e3, queen f4. Because rook c3 is a pretty serious threat. Now, is there increment? I don't think so. I don't think there's any increment, which means that flagging is definitely a part of the equation. Queen to b4. By Hikaru, he's putting the pressure, the heat on the knight on d4. Okay, no increment. So, flagging is on the table, which means that that's part of the reason why this is such big odds. Queen f4. Hikaru's bishop is attacked. He's got to move it. Where does he move it? He moves it to d7. I would go rook a d1 if I were MVL. Trying to get my rook in the game. Okay. Okay. Let's see. MVL thinking. I don't like his position. At all. I think that it's very hard to recover in a4. Hikaru doing a really good job putting the pressure on the queen side. He's chipping away from the other side. I'm not sure where MVL is going to get his chances. He's got a nice knight. But the point of a4, and he trades queens. So knight takes f4 now is interesting. And we're going to see some sort of an endgame where it is true that the knight is good. But now rook c2 comes to mind. Maybe you attack the pawn on f2. It's frozen. No, it's not. It's not frozen. I don't think it is. Yeah. And bishop e6 by Hikaru. Okay, so he stabilizes the situation. He does have 2 minutes and 25 seconds. That's going to be an important thing. I'm going to refresh the board so the clock starts ticking for you guys. And this is equal. Rook to c4, MVL. No, this is not winnable. And Hikaru is going to carry this match. And he's going to carry this match. And MVL missing the golden opportunity in the previous game. Unless MVL can find a way to flag him or trick him. Board is frozen still. Sorry. Yeah, it is frozen now. Damn it. Worst possible moment. Okay, this is the position. Guys, I got it. This is the position. So now we're good, I think. Okay, so he's got to keep the pieces on the board. Maybe get the knight back to d4. But now d4. I think this move is key. Let's see if Hikaru plays it. d4, forcing the trade. And this is just a dead draw. He does it. He does it. Knight d4. Now rook d8 is also possible. You can go rook d8. Bishop takes a2. MVL's going to have to go for the flag here. And he's going to have to find a way to not trade every single piece. Because if Hikaru's going to have like a minute and a half in a rook versus rook position, flagging is absolutely on the table. If I were MVL, I would try to keep pieces on the board. I would go rook b1 here. Because the more pieces are on the board, the more Hikaru has to think. And that's exactly what MVL does. Okay. So let's see what happens here. Hikaru thinking. Every second that passes is a golden second. He's got a minute and 39. This is going to be close because MVL is slightly better here. He's the one pushing. But Hikaru, the position is definitely still drawn at the same time. Rook to b2. Minute and a half now for Hikaru. He's got the passed pawn. He defends it. MVL's got the good knight. And he's got a nice little pawn structure going here on the king side. This is a dead draw, but a minute extra now for MVL, who's got to win this game. Well, it's not that he allowed these trades. He had no choice. He had no choice in this position. Maybe knight to c2. But no, I doubt that he's going to pull this out, because Hikaru is just too fast and too accurate. And that last game was his biggest chance. That last game was a huge chance. And Hikaru trades the rooks. He's gone rook a2. I apologize for the choppy transmission. That's just how it's coming through. Knight to c6. MVL stops the pawn. Whoa, bishop d5 would meet with knight e7. So some bite to the position remaining. But this is a draw. I mean, Hikaru just has to approach with his king. But MVL could approach with his. f5, bishop b3, f5. Okay. Now king to d4, king c5. The problem is, yep, bishop to d1, tying himself to the pawn. And now g5 is a very strong move. And that shatters any hopes that MVL may have had of winning this game. He takes in g5. h5 is possible. He takes. Total liquidation. This is going to be a draw. And Hikaru is going to carry this match. And all credit to him. MVL with a huge miss in the last game. That is true. But gotta tip your hat to Hikaru for that defensive display. And it's not over yet. MVL trying his best. Under a minute now for Hikaru, but it's enough time here to make the draw. It's enough time here to make the draw. But Hikaru's got to be careful, because if you get, ooh, wait a minute, careful, e6. Oh, this is whoa, 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 whoa. Is this a draw? Is this a draw? This is probably a draw, because b3 and b2. This is a typical technique. Yeah, it's a draw. It's a draw. Oh, but king g2. Wait a minute, is it a draw? This might be a win. Knight to c3. Wait a second. Who's winning? This might be a draw. This is very... These positions are always very close, but it's probably a draw. It's probably a draw. Knight b1, it's a draw. It's still a draw, because the king always comes to g4 in this situation. I would go knight b1 here. And then king d4. And black by the skin of his teeth. That is very Hikaru cutting it very close. King f4, king d3, knight a3, king c3. This is a draw. But MVL has several attempts here. Knight a3 maybe. It's a draw, but the time situation, Hikaru's got to be very careful. He's got to be very careful. But now king f5. Okay, so now I would go king f2. Okay, king f2. The problem for MVL, and it's a draw. They've agreed to draw. It says draw because they've repeated moves. That was one. And it's official. That was two, that was one, that was two, and that was three. It's a three-time repetition. The game has ended in a draw. And there's simply no way to win this position. The pawn ties the knight down. As soon as white king goes after black's pawn, then king g4 comes, and you win the pawn. Hikaru knew this position, and it is a draw. It is an objective draw. And yeah, there's just no way to win. So an incredible, incredible display. Good morning. Hope everyone is well. Good afternoon to some of you. Yeah, so we're we're tuning into round 3 of the Skilling Open. We have Magnus Nepo in front of us and Nakamura So game 3 in front of us as well. So we're going to be watching those games, and then time permitting, I'll see if I can get some blitz in as well. I'm also eating some breakfast. I hope you guys don't mind. I'll be muting myself just to chew and stuff. Yesterday evening, we hit 4,000 subs for the first time. I'm still riding the high of that. I have no words to describe the events of last evening, and I'll thank everyone properly later. But in the meantime, let's jump into the games. So it appears to me, thank you, Nace Salite, for the prime. Recovery goes great. I'm pain-free. Knock on wood. I'm feeling great this morning. So, you know, I don't think we could either. Yesterday was Thanksgiving, so people expressed their gratitude to me, and that made me blush, but I feel like words cannot express my gratitude to this community. But anyways, we have Nakamura. So I think Wesley's leading by a point, and Carlsen is leading by a point. All right. And I hope you guys don't mind if I do a little light eating. I'll be muting myself temporarily for like a couple seconds at a time. Okay. So what we have here in Nakamura is an interesting position. We had a Tarash counter gambit with c takes d4. This is actually a very underestimated line. I never found an advantage in this line. See, the interesting thing about this line is that it isn't popular, but it's actually very robust, and I was not able to find an advantage for white in this line. And it seems like Wesley did a good job equalizing. Just bishop b4, knight e4, ruined white's pawn structure. And this is actually a very typical structure, where black has a deficiency on d5. I mean, that's an isolated queen's pawn, and if we look at the square in front of it, it's very well controlled by white's pawns. But on the other hand, if we look at white's pawn structure on the queen side, that's also very deficient. White's got these two isolated pawns, which are kind of weak. And the two just balance themselves out. So maybe white is a tiny bit better here, because he's got a very active knight. Maybe queen c2 to threaten checkmate. This comes to mind. And you force a little weakness in black's king side with g6. But now bishop f5 is a threat, and that pins the queen to the rook. So I'm not sure. Yeah, Hikaru's going to have to generate some chances. Of course, against MVL, he lost the first day's matchup and then came back in a big way. I mean, I personally, one of my biggest pet peeves is overly loud yawns. That's from another thing. I don't know if anybody knows that reference. But overly loud eating noises, like chewing with the mouth open. I'm sensitive to the fact that can be very annoying. So that's why I mute myself when I eat. Okay, so let's check in on Nepo against Carlsen. Woo! It looks like Nepo is succeeding here. 2 minutes and 40 seconds for Carlsen, and he seems to be worse. He's down a pawn. Nepo's got connected passers. This seems like a Grunfeld's gone completely wrong for Magnus. Hello, GM Hess. Look at this man. Always stalking my streams. I wonder who that is. No mukbang stream, no. Especially with how easy it is to mute my... And that's what people want anyway, for me to shut the hell up finally. Okay, so we had a Grunfeld. And Magnus, wow, Nepo, look at this man. Refusing the draw. Of course, Magnus winning the second game, so a draw is in his favor. That would leave it with only one more game. But Nepo going for it, grabbing the pawn on a2, which is very typical to sacrifice this pawn. But it seems like Magnus wasn't able to procure sufficient compensation. Nepo just pushed it. Nepo just said, I have an extra pass pawn. I'm going to push the hell out of it. And it seems like Magnus is in grave danger here. But we all know, and this is just my artificial impression, I'm not a specialist in these positions, but it seems to me that Magnus's compensation lies in the fact that, well, he's got two very strong passers in the center, but they're not going anywhere. I mean, if you play d6, you can't do this, because the bishop's just going to take the rook. And if you go e6 again, you drop the rook. So that's out of the question. Carlsen scrambling to keep Nepo's pieces out of his grill. Queen trade offered, which is in black's favor, because he's got the passed pawns. I won't mute myself drinking, though. This is my first day I'm allowing myself coffee. So I'm going to be pretty high in a moment. I haven't had coffee in like a week. But I figured today was safe. Just really quickly, can you have coffee 3 days after wisdom teeth removal? I'm pretty sure it's fine. I've been taking no chances. Yeah, 24 hours. Okay, we're good. Devronicus, thank you for gifting to Luxy. Alright, so we're just watching things unfold. Nepo can take another pawn here. But he's got to be careful. He doesn't want to lose this pawn. This is the pride, the jewel of the Nile. As Michael Douglas. Wait, what's that movie called? Romancing the Stone? And then what's the second movie called? Is it The Jewel of the Nile? Anyways, doesn't matter. Here I go with my 80s movie references again. But if Nepo takes on d5, then... Well, Magnus can't take here, right? Because takes, rook d2. And it's always important to know, when you have a fianchettoed bishop, there's very rare that there's a back rank mate, because you can play bishop f8. So what exactly does Magnus want to do here? I think that's what Nepo's trying to figure out. There was a Jewel of the Nile. Dude, I love those movies. Those movies are great. Wait, it was Michael Douglas. Who was the female actress? I should know that. Okay. Apparently Nepo left the room a while ago, and the official stream is making a drama. Kathleen Turner. Damn it, Jesus. Terrible. So Nepo goes g5. Very sensible move. Obviously, what he's trying to do is break into White's pawn structure so that the bishop could land on e5, which would spell death for White. And Magnus can't... I mean, in such situations, you normally go g3. Obviously, you can't do that here. Magnus' position is collapsing completely. You don't see this very often. Magnus with the white pieces, 30 moves in, struggling to stay alive for a couple more moves. I think he's completely lost. And look at the time disparity as well. Stop the mount. I'm trying to mount my iPad and I'm failing. Okay. Thank you, Emio Walter, for the tier 1. And I'm in disbelief right now. Magnus does not lose games like this very often. I mean, you can try g4. Maybe g... But then just bishop e4. I mean, what's the big deal? Magnus below 2 minutes. Wow. This is pretty impressive. This calls for another couple bites. Okay. Bishop b4, going after the pawn. But is he? I mean, gf, rook a3. Rook a3 again. You can't take with the rook because d1 is hanging. If you take with the bishop, this is over. Rook cannot keep both bishops defended at the same time. I'm going to take one of them. I think... Magnus wants this. He wants to skewer the rook to the bishop. I'm eating oatmeal. And... But even here, after rook d4, you're counterattacking White's bishop. So if we consider what happens when the smoke clears, takes. I mean, Magnus has succeeded in eliminating the pawn, but now into the game comes Black's bishop. Black's up 3 pawns. No, this is just over. I think Nepo can just play gf for starters, and maybe there's something even better. That is Kasparov in the picture behind me, yes. So Gary Kasparov hosted a bunch of masterclasses in New York for so-called talented young players. I don't know how I made the cut. And this was about 2004, 2005. My YouTube banner picture is also one of my best photos with Kasparov. And it was a super interesting experience. You know, the first time you lay eyes on Kasparov, it's like, I mean, he walks into the room and everybody just takes this breath, you know, it's like, oh my God, Kasparov. And there's this energy that accompanies him, which it's hard to explain. Until you see him. But this guy is a god, and everybody was absolutely starstruck. And we got a $10 donation from Matterhorn. Thank you. Thank you for not advertising yourself every 2 seconds. Way better commentary than the official. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that you enjoying the commentary, and I apologize for not starting it earlier. I did want to force myself to get some sleep, because I don't want to play any games with anything, really. And, okay, so checking back into Hikaru against Wesley, it looks like Wesley is in very good shape here. He's got very active pieces. We have an equal material end. So what happens? Hikaru decided to transform the structure by taking the bishop and breaking through with c4. Wesley responded with knight e5. That's a very strong move, because the queen is hanging. It cannot take. So Hikaru instead, well, he was forced to defend c5, and so we had a big trade there. And we have an endgame, and I think it's an equal endgame. What are the pros and cons for both sides here? Well, first thing that jumps to mind, right, is the rook on a6 is very nice. It attacks e6. It holds down Black's rook on c7. And you have a situation with a knight against a bishop. And in these situations, you always want to weigh the pros and cons of the knight and the bishop in the given position. Position is pretty closed, so knights are generally good in close positions, but if you notice, black has a bunch of pawns on light squares, which means that the bishop can exploit them if, for example, Hikaru plays e4. That's the idea of bishop b3. He wants to break into black's pawn chain with e4. So something like knight c4 comes to mind, covering it with black's body. Wesley's made a move. Knight d3, similar. And against e4, does anybody see what his idea is? Hikaru's made a move, but just to involve everybody, what was his idea with knight d3? What do you mean 5 pawns each is still considered close? So the knight from d3, very jumpy knight. Boom, boom, boom. So you attack the rook, and then you win the pawn. So Hikaru has gone h4, just expanding on the king side, biding his time, making a healthy move. A lot of people see moves like this from GMs, and they just, oh, you know, he's got some hidden intention. I'll never understand such a move. Moves like h4 in the endgame are not... I mean, they are deep at times, but the reality is they're just improving moves, right? You're creating some luft for the king. Maybe later on you're going to use this pawn as a battering ram to weaken black's defenses a little bit more. But you see this move all the time. It's sort of, as my old coach would say, completing the architectural design of the pawns, right? It's like this move that everybody makes in the endgame. Wesley could basically draw the game with knight c5. And this is just a draw. I mean, you have total liquidation. You have a 4 Rook End Game and a draw. So Wesley's contemplating this. But if I were black, I would consider playing for the advantage with something like Rook b8 first, maybe to prepare knight c5. That's an interesting idea. Or maybe just go to b4, something like that. On the other hand, Wesley has a point ahead in the match, so is it worth it for him to press his luck here? Given that he has white in the last match game? Probably not. So we'll see. Oh my god, this happened exactly. This is exactly what happened. He went knight c5, rook a5. This is exactly what happened. And it's going to be a draw. Gotta uphold my name, you know? No, but I mean, this is not anything impressive on my part. It was just the very obvious development of the game. And this is going to be agreed to draw any second. Let's look at the Magnus game. So Magnus has managed to transform the game into an end game where Nepo is up 2 pawns. One of the pawns, this is the important pawn, right? This is the passed pawn. This is the one that's going to win him the game, hopefully, for Nepo. But how did Magnus manage to get this relatively... Okay, so he somehow... Yeah, so this happened. Oh, bishop e7. Ah, and he went after the pawn this way. Interesting. So Nepo decided to... Okay, I'll give it up. I'll take the other one. And we have a rook endgame. Now, let's not jump to conclusions here. Magnus is down 2 pawns. It looks like he's completely lost. Maybe he is. But my experience tells me that these endgames are never that easy. Because how does Nepo make progress? The rook guards the pawn. Black's rook can't leave e5, right? If it leaves e5, it has to go right back. The king can't really leave g5. If it goes to f6, you're going to take the pawn. Believe it or not, I mean, maybe Magnus is in Zugzwang. Maybe that's the idea. Because if Magnus drops his king back to f2, well, maybe he can. And he does. And he can just shuffle between these 2 squares until the Earth turns into a supernova. Nepo has realistically only one idea. He's got to walk his king over to the other side of the board. He has to go king f5 at some point. Maybe not here. Maybe he pushes his h-pawn first. At some point, he's going to have to make a run for it. And the idea is going to be to just start giving up these pawns, but to use the king to dislodge the rook from b4. I don't see any other ways to try to win this game. I respectfully disagree with Svidler. I don't think it's a simple draw. In fact, I think after king f5, I mean, first of all, Peter has a much better understanding of endgames than I do, and let me put that out there immediately. Let me shoot down any people thinking that I'm being presumptuous. I think if you should trust anyone, it's Svidler. But to my eye, this doesn't look easy to draw at all. I mean, what if the king just walks over to c5 and then you start pushing the pawn? So clearly there's something here that I'm missing because Nepo is thinking, and Nepo usually plays fast if he's confident. Well, the problem is, I mean, if you take rook f4, I go rook f5 and I force the rook trade. right? So you can play, and again, if you take it with the king, if you take it with the king, I don't care. The rook on e5 is guarding the 5th rank. You can't pass it. Nepo goes rook d5 and rook c5. I'm not sure what I'm missing, guys. I'll be honest. I'm just not sure why it is that Nepo can't try to make a run for it. And if it's a draw there, okay, then make Magnus work for it. Why not defend both pawns with rook f5? Well, that's what Nepo was doing, but where do you go from here? Remember, black needs to make progress. It's not enough to just say, oh, I have 2 extra pawns, I'm awesome. Like, Magnus is just going to sit there and do nothing. And, you know, you can take those extra 2 pawns and, you know, you can... Magnus is like, you can put them where the sun doesn't shine, but eventually you'll have to make progress, and that means sacrificing one of them. But okay, I think maybe king goes to f5 and... No, but I mean, okay, maybe king goes to d5, I think it's draw, but no, but you should not listen to this Naroditsky. He wrote a book on endgames that I now use as toilet paper to wipe my behind with, but okay, I think maybe this is the equal draw. Alright, that was pretty funny. No, but I mean... Nepo continues to think he's got below 2 minutes. There we go. What did I tell you, guys? What did I tell you? Here he comes with his king. I told you he'd make a run for it. Okay, so I'm not crazy. Now, if king f4, you have rook c4 check, forcing the rook trade. This might still be a draw. c3, king d3, 5, c3, f4. No, it's winning. Boom, boom, boom. And you use the pawn as a decoy. You walk around, take all the pawns. So Magnus has to calculate this. He might have to... And rook f4, there's rook f5. So there's a rook trade against both ways of taking the pawn. Thank you for the 100 bits. So Magnus can't take the pawn. Or can he? Maybe I've miscalculated this, but I don't think so. So here, 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 here. Yeah, this I just checked. This is winning. Okay. This is winning. So if Magnus can't take the pawn, then that means he's got to make a wasting move, such as rook b1. But that gives black a crucial tempo to advance his king further to supervise the pawn. And the main road, well, you can go king c4, right? If you give a check, you can start sidestepping the rook. Yermolinsky taught me this. This is the ideal position for supervising the pawn forward. Because if you continue to give checks, I'll go to b2, and then I'll start pushing the pawn. So I'm not seeing how Magnus makes a draw here. I'll be honest with you guys. Okay, let me take a couple bites as we watch this endgame unfold. Hikaru and So officially have made a draw. Now, after the game, I'll show you guys what I do. If I was a serious student of the game, and I wanted to squeeze the most instructive value out of this endgame and use chess base, I'll show you exactly what I do to enhance my knowledge of these positions. Rook e5. So again, you cannot take the pawn. That's a key, right? Because rook f5, and you force the rook trade, and then the pawn endgame is very clearly winning because black's got the outside pass pawn, which is used to distract white's king, and in the meantime, black's king is going to come in and take white's pawns. And Nepo defends his pawn. He says, okay, for the time being, he's going to keep his pawn protected. And that's a stopgap, right? The rook is not going to remain on f5 forever. I think it's going to remain on f5 as long as possible to delay the process of white trying to inch his way forward and take some of black's pawn. So I'm anticipating king d6 here. Oh, look at the patience. First, he plays h5. First, he improves his position, stops the king's passage to g4. But eventually, again, he's going to have to take the plunge, and he's going to start walking his king in. Let's see when that moment comes. Magnus doesn't have much that he can do. He tries his best to put his body over the king's walk, king e4. So, again, to be very clear, what I'm not understanding here, from my perspective, is why it is that Nepo can't give a check and just walk his king to c5. The king is cut off from coming to e4, and then you just start supervising the pawn's progress with the king. So there's something there that I'm missing. There's a source of counterplay, I'm pretty sure. But we'll see what Nepo does here. He's got below 2 minutes. You've got to leave yourself some time. But imagine defending this with a minute. I mean, Jesus. h4. So he's fixing the pawns first, which is sensible, I suppose. And it's not that Magnus has anything particularly useful that he can do. Rook a1. Careful. Don't go here. You blunder the rook. Rook a6 and king takes f. Don't worry. Nepo won't do that. If you're a Nepo fan, you don't have to worry. He won't do that. Yeah, well, rook c5 is the same idea, right? You got to leave with the rook. If you want to push this pawn, you can't let white maintain contact with your rook. You've got to do something about that. Okay. I'm not entirely sold on Nepo's pawn push here. I'm not sure if that does more harm or good. And the sad reality is these endgames are among the most, how should I put it, confusable endgames possible, even for GMs. I mean, I'm looking at this and I have no idea if it's winning or drawn. I have no idea what the correct strategy is, and let me fill you in on something. Neither does Nepo, most probably, because, and this is no insult to him, it's just that these are very hard to study. You how do you study this particular endgame? How do you know what to do? So it's all up to guesswork and intuition. That's where these 2700s are true geniuses. They're able to figure out what to do without really having seen similar endgames. And even the computer can struggle to evaluate these positions. That's how complex they are. That's how complex they are. Trust me on this. Don't be quick to bury these players and say, I thought Nepo was good. Look at all these mistakes he's making. This is super confusing stuff, and nobody really knows what they're doing here. So what's going on here? Magnus has managed to relocate his rook behind the pawn. That's a huge accomplishment for white. I'm not sure why Nepo has allowed this. Now, if Nepo goes after white's pawns, then the thing to notice here is that all of the pawns are now on one flank. And that means they're a lot easier to manage for white's king. White just starts chopping up all these pawns with his king and his rook. You know, black could go up 2 pawns, formally speaking. But this is, but this is going to be a draw. You know, white can just go after this pawn. And it seems to me like Nepo has perhaps given away his biggest chances of winning the game. Maybe he go, okay, rook g2, but now rook b5. This is definitely a draw now. And the interesting thing is that rook b6 first by Magnus to chase the king away first. And now you can even play, rook b5. So you could have a position with f and h pawns against the king. And that is a draw. You can find this in any endgame manual. I can even prove to you that is the case. If I hunt down, let me see if I have an endgame book at hand, which I surprisingly don't know where all my endgames books went. Where is my copy of Fundamental Chess Endings? That is my most prized possession. There it is. So if we look at, and this is what you would do before the internet, right? You'd have a book like this. You'd say, okay, I want to figure out if an endgame like this is drawn. Rook versus 2 pawns, 164. This is a book that flies under the radar, and I highly recommend it. Oh, no, we want Rook End Games. Rook versus Rook, Rook and Pawns versus Rook, 177. And here we go. So, I'm looking for Rook and 2 pawns. You have all sorts of endgames here. Sharon, here's Rook and 2 pawns against Rook. And I'm looking for Rook and F and H pawns. It's got to be there. That's got to be there. Rook, F, and H pawns. I even had, yep, there we go. So there's my Zealous. There we go, Gligerich-Smyslov. Look. Gligerich-Smyslov. And let me just see. You see that he's analyzing this endgame. Even I had it once, and this is a draw. So he's indicating equality. And this is not the same. This is not the same endgame, because here white has a much better version of it. If you look, white's king has frozen the rook and pawn in place. If you go h2, you allow king g2, the rook has to move, and you take the pawn, and the draw is very elementary. So the question for Nepo is, can he dislodge white's king from g3? Magnus says no, because he's keeping the rook on a5. This is sort of a Philidor-like defense. You can't go f4. It's illegal. If you move your king away, big whoop. You know, I go rook b5, and again, if you go f4, I think you can just take the pawn. h2, you go back to g3, you are in time to stop the pawn. No way to make progress. And do you think Hikaru would play king rook versus king rook in this tournament? Why? Well, rook g1, I take the pawn. That's the idea. But Nepo's going to have to go rook b. Yeah. So Nepo's only chance is to do this and then king g4. Now, what to understand in this position? This one I know these endgames pretty well. White's easiest defense is to go rook a8. Now, in such positions, and those of you familiar with Rook End games, you would know that basically the Philidor defense, or the third rank defense, is the easiest way to draw such a position. There we go. But what some people don't know is there is an alternate drawing method where you put the rook behind the pawn for the duration of this endgame. So rook f8 here would be a drawing move. And I can show basically the drawing methods. Rook a4. There's many ways to draw this. This is even better for white because the pawn isn't anywhere near f3. So there's multiple methods here of drawing this. King e3, rook a. This is unbelievable that Magnus pulled this off. Okay, this is even easier. King g3 because the pawn isn't even going to f4. Normally in these endgames, the pawn is already on f4, so this would be not possible. But here, the draw is very elementary because black simply cannot make any progress. Incredible. Now you just go rook b4, for example. You just do nothing, right? And as soon as black's king moves away, you go out to f4, and the pawn is toast. You just go rook f4 and you win the pawn. And rook f4. Oh, Magnus just picks off the pawn right away. King h4 and king g5. Okay, king h4 here was a little bit easier than king g5, but it's fine. Thank you, Frostex, and 200 bits from Oversoul. Appreciate it. This is a dead draw. And they agreed to a draw. Wow. An incredible comeback from Magnus. And that just shows you how hard this guy is to bring down. And what I could do, like let's say you were to look at this game, you're like, man, I want to know more about these types of endgames, right? Let me make a search for this pawn strategy. Let me see if I can find in ChessBase any similar endgames from chess history. It's going to be a bit of a tall order. Let me see if I can do a quick search while the games haven't started yet to show you how I would go about studying this type of endgame. Let me think for a second. So what we want is this. We want this. And now we want rooks, and we want 3 pawns for black and 2 pawns for white. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so I found some similar, and here we go. So for example, I can make a search, and I can tell you guys that we had, for example, the following game, which is not the same. And just give me a second, please. I'm changing scenes. So this is kind of a cool use of ChessBase, right? If you want to know how I would train this, just give me one second, please. Okay, we need to make this a little bit bigger. Okay, we need to make it a little smaller. And we're good. Bing, bang, boom. And now we need to make the player names. Perfect. And we're good. So this is not the game this is not the Nepo game. This is a game between 2 grandmasters. Flores is a grandmaster from Argentina, Cuartas from Colombia. And they reached a very similar endgame to the Magnus Nepo, with the exception that black has no pawn on f4. And you can see that in this endgame, well, the king was cut off, and let's see what black did here. Okay, you had a similar way of defending. And here, the difference is that white decided to use his king to defend the pawn and use his rook on the other side. Magnus basically did the opposite. And it seems like this strategy backfired because eventually what happened is that the king ended up too far away from the pawn and it was cut off. Yeah, it was cut off, and eventually black got the Lucena position, which is a very famous theoretical position. There was another, so that was one example of when that was reached. There was a very old game from the 1930s where this happened. William Brugger against William Winter was a very strong player. He was a famous player. But here, Winter decided to go for that endgame we were talking about, rook and 2 against a rook. And the game ended in a draw. Like, these endgames are not easy to win. And sorry, these endgames are not easy to draw, even if they're theoretically drawn. And black managed to win this one, even though the position was drawn. So I think that where Nepo missed his main win was that he, for some reason, king d6 in this position would be a good example of what I think is a winning move. And you say, okay, I'm going to give up the pawns, right? I don't care. And I'm just going to push my pawn because the rook cuts off the king. And I'm not sure why he didn't do that, to be honest with you guys. So, we'll see. I need to run to the restroom. I'll be right back. I'm going to put on Nakamura So Nakamura, which just started. I'll be right back, guys. So what do we have going on here? We have a Dutch. Hikaru in a must-win situation today. Mainline Dutch. Okay, this is all basically normal. G5, wow. We have a sort of a weird structure. We have a very weird structure. So there's 4 games. This is the final game of today's mini-match. Between Hikaru and Wesley and between Nepo and Carlsen. Now, the winner of today's match, they play again tomorrow. And you know, if you win today and lose tomorrow, then you play the Blitz playoff. That's like what Hikaru did against MBL yesterday. And so we'll see. We'll see. Thank you, Coach Grant. We also had a 100 bits from Fizz Buzz Puzz. Thank you so much. All right. Now, how do we understand this position? What do we look at when we look at a position like this? There is sort of a sequence of items that we can go through and compare them. The first is king safety, and you know, when you look at the kings, whose king is safer? Probably white's, because you can understand that there's a potential for white to play f3, and you know, black has played g5, so you know, black needs to keep an eye on his king. White's king seems perfectly safe. Then you look at the pawn structure, and definitely, well, it's not easy to say. Well, clearly, visually, black's pawn structure looks horrible, but he's also got a lot of pawns in the center. That counts for something. Then you look at piece activity. Okay, black's bishops kind of crisscross the board, and white's bishops are both staring into pawns, which is not a good thing. Their kinetic energy is low, but their potential energy is high. If you look at the bishop on g2, it could deploy itself to h3. This move f3 that I mentioned, Wesley could prepare it, because if you play f3 immediately, then what might end up happening is you might end up losing the pawn on d4. I'm not even sure that's good for black, because look at black's pawns now. Let's see what Wesley did. He played rook c1, and Hikaru plays g4. Yeah, so Hikaru trying to discourage Wesley from playing f3, and also he's setting up a potential attack here on the king side. Which is kind of interesting. Now, Wesley, what is he doing? He's aiming his pieces down the c-file. So Wesley could already consider taking. Hikaru has to take with this pawn. And, well, Wesley could take this pawn, but Hikaru would take that one. And now if you look at the bishop on g2, it's permanently buried. And that is not a situation you want to find yourself in. So that's kind of out of the question. I think for Wesley, he could take and maybe now defend the... Or maybe he could try queen c6. Kind of forking the bishop and the pawn. And then you take a better pawn, a juicier one. This seems a little bit more palatable, but still, I mean, leaving yourself with a bishop like this, especially when its counterpart is also kind of dull, is a little bit suspicious. So I would still consider going f3 if I were Wesley. I would totally still consider going f3, just to like untangle my pieces out of this morass that they find themselves in. You could also take and go rook fe1, preemptively defend the pawn. And try to aim for that pawn on c6. I don't like this, though, because if you look very carefully at the pawn on f2, that pawn becomes weak, and black could attack it. And this is right up Hikaru's alley, these kinds of positions. So, that's an SAT where morass? Yeah, that's like a swamp. I don't know why I didn't just say swamp.
Well, probably because you went to Stanford. Oh.
Yeah, but anyways. Let's see what happens now. Let's see what happens now. So f3 is what I'm kind of anticipating. I mean, it's very hard to predict. And let me refresh so the clock start ticking. It's very hard to predict what happens in these kinds of positions. There's so many different ways to approach these kinds of positions. And e3 by Wesley. Huh, interesting. So he's basically said, I'm not going f3 at all. And he's going for a different strategy to activate the bishop. I think what he's going for is moving the rook out of f1 and then going bishop f1. So he wants to deploy his bishop like this, right? The downside of that is once you move your rook away from f1, you weaken the pawn on f2. So Hikaru might be eyeing something like this. Hikaru might also be eyeing a rook lift followed by a queen lift. And going after the h2 pawn. This is a very typical way of attacking. Wesley has gone bishop a3. And Hikaru goes... Okay, so he goes h5. He wants to open up the h-file. I think Hikaru's intentions are very clear. And Wesley's going to have to do something fast. Because if he lets Hikaru open the h-file... And, you know, this is going to take Hikaru a while. to get all his pieces to the H file. But if he does that, then you could get checkmated in 2 moves. I mean, if you get to let a queen on H2, you could get checkmated very quickly. So if I were Wesley, I'd start considering exchange sacrifices. I mean, I'd start considering pretty drastic measures to try to open the position up before black gets all his pieces to the king side. Maybe you move your rook first. I mean, maybe he's got time for this. But very quickly, he's got to take on d5 and open stuff up. He does exactly that. Now, here's the problem. And this is what I think Wesley might not have anticipated. In this position, Hikaru can already take with the e-pawn. And that rook on f6, it moonlights as a defender for the pawn, and it's going to still go to h6. And the third thing that's annoying here for Wesley is this bishop on a6 is stopping the king from escaping. So bishop h6 instead by Hikaru. Yeah, like I said, there's many ways to attack here. It's hard to predict exactly what will be chosen. So what Hikaru is doing maybe is he's not hurrying. Queen d2, they're playing very fast. I'm not entirely sure what it is that both players are so in a rush about. I mean, it's bishop c8. Okay, so Hikaru, I guess, was defending against some queen a5 ideas and maybe rerouting the bishop to d7 to give some more beef to that pawn on c6. Queen to b4 by Wesley. Where is this battery going? Well, maybe he's going for queen e7. He's trying to trade queens. And as we discussed, because black is the one trying to attack on the king side, even though I misevaluated the king safety earlier, I thought black's king was less safe. But in light of what's happened, even though, and this is a typical paradox that people sometimes get confused, it is true that black's king is more open, per se, right? But the analogy that I like to give in these situations is, you know, that famous case of a tree falling in a forest and nobody hears it. So did the tree make a sound? Now, the same goes for king safety. If your king could be wide open, it could be the emperor without any clothes, okay? And it's this, you know, you wake up in your apartment, you live alone, you know, you can go half a day without putting your clothes on, and that's not improper. But then if you have a roommate, you know, he's not going to remain your roommate if you do that. So it's all about whether there are pieces on the side of the board where there are weaknesses. If a weakness is inaccessible, then it's not really a weakness for the time being. On the other hand, white's got more pawns. That analogy was interesting. Yeah. But but here's the thing, guys. Nobody's going to forget this now. You can laugh, but now everybody's going to remember how to evaluate king safety, and that is my ultimate goal here, is to help people remember these concepts. So Wesley's got more pawns on the king side, but black has more pieces there. So black is the one attacking. Wesley's piling up on the c-file. Hikaru finally gets his rook to h6, which we kind of anticipated happening. And he's got this long-term idea now of bringing the queen to h5. All right. Is it true that Hikaru is semi-retired from classical? Well, I think it's going that way. I also think that there have been no classical tournaments over the board, right? So this is the equivalent right now of classical chess. I don't think Hikaru is going to retire permanently from classical when it resumes in full force. I think he's going to tone things down. I think things are going well for him on the Twitch front. And, you know, it's his choice entirely. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see. I wouldn't jump to any conclusions or make any assumptions. We'll let him do the talking. And again, I don't like talking about this because it always brings on the kind of conversations which I don't like to have on my stream. But I do feel the need to clarify this from time to time because there's new people in my stream, and I appreciate that. But to those thinking that there is some sort of a beef between me and Hikaru, there never was. There isn't, and my guess is that there never will be. We are both competitors. I say this in the best interpretation of the word. I wouldn't say our rivals, but you know, we go for bullet rankings, and I'm number one, and he's much stronger than me. But you know, we have this spirit of competition, but there's a lot of mutual respect, and there's no need to make anything other than what it is out of that. Okay, so I just wanted to make that very clear. We definitely troll each other. We don't see eye to eye on everything. You know, I've had my issues with how he's acted, and I'm sure he's had his issues with how I've acted, and that's totally fine. But that doesn't mean there can't exist a tremendous amount of mutual respect, which there does. And that's all I'll say on the topic, because there's no need to discuss it further. Okay. It's healthy. It's an atmosphere of healthy competition. We have a healthy working relationship. So that's all there is to it. Yeah. So back to the game. Robert is making a very good point. I don't know why I should listen to this GM Hess character, but this GM Hess character actually made a good point. The bishop on g2 is biting on granite, but there was a Romanian grandmaster many years ago who said bad bishops defend good pawns. Well, if you want to extend this quote, bad bishops also defend good squares. And if you prognosticate a scenario, I'm just going to make a couple of random moves, where Hikaru gets his pieces on the h-file, what's very important about this bishop is that it defends the h1 square. And this really makes black stuck in terms of delivering checkmate, because the king is virtually always going to be guaranteed at least a new lease on life once it gets to f1. Now, Hikaru could try to circumvent this by tripling on the h-file, and then there's a pretty common queen sacrifice here. So something to this effect would be checkmate. The problem is Wesley could preempt this by running with his king before Hikaru gets his queen to h1. Yeah, Shuba is right. Okay. I don't think Hess knows what the hell he's talking about. But anyways, that's a good point. I must begrudgingly admit. And so Wesley is allowing himself to expand his influence over the queen side. He's pushing his pawns up. He's eyeing some b5 ideas. And it may very well be that Hikaru has run out of fuel to make this attack work in the true sense of the word. And in addition, the lines that I showed are not valid because as soon as you move the queen away, you give up c7. So Hikaru is going to have to solve that problem as well. I think things have gone wrong. I'm not reading. I'm just flipping through absentmindedly through the book I recommended yesterday. I have a habit of this, as you guys know. I just flip through pages randomly while commentating, while doing streaming. Okay. Mr. Gambini, that was a lucid, intelligent, well-thought-out objection. Overruled. From my favorite movie. So is it possible that two Utes... Excuse me, what was that? Two what? Did you say Utes? What is a Ute? Okay, so b5, here we go. Wesley strikes on the queen side, and he makes things go boom. Okay, so what's going on here? Takes, takes, takes. You would take this one, and this would be in white's crosshairs, and the position collapses. And this is what I mentioned, right? Black's king was safe by virtue of the fact that white had no pieces attacking it. Now, white finally has an artery, a direct artery to black's king, and there will be hell to pay. I mean, rook d7 and rook c7 already wins the queen, and that's a direct result of the king being completely disrobed, let's say, by the pawns that have abandoned him. I was looking for a different word, but... Yeah, so I came home in the evening and I disrobed. That's a pretty funny word, to disrobe. How much disrobing have you done in your life? Alright, I don't know why all these clothes analogies today. But anyways, queen to... Well, because the king is undefended. I guess that's the source of it. The king going... Yeah, that's right. HG, Hikaru opens the H-file, which he has to try to do, but it's not going to be enough. Like this Grandmaster Hess character mentioned, you can do this until tomorrow morning, but you're not going to deliver anything other than an empty check on H1. The rook's going to be captured. Yeah, a judge would disrobe. So, all right. I am wearing pants for the record. And what was the name of... I'm looking for a particular person that... Yeah. I will not be participating in any Zoom calls anytime soon. Okay. Let's throw any illusions of that in the garbage bin. Okay. So queen b4. And now in this position... Well, again, Hikaru is trying to keep his position together. B takes c6 is possible. Wesley can also play c takes d5. And yeah, okay, Hikaru is trying to keep his position together. Even if Wesley takes on c6, which he just did, Hikaru will ignore the pawn. He's not going to take back because that would do white's bidding for him and open the c file. But even with the C file closed, again, it's very important to point out here that that the H file isn't going to give black any immediate benefits. So Wesley's going to have to find a way to enhance the pressure on the C file. Let's look at Carlsen Nepo. Yeah, so Nepo Carlsen has been a fascinating game, as you guys can see. A Berlin with Rook E1 in a must-win game for Nepo. Pretty interesting choice. And wow, okay. I think that we didn't miss out on this game. Thank you, Ku42, for the sub. Wow. The format is, well, if Hikaru loses today's matchup, they will again play the same format tomorrow. Whoa, sorry. This is interesting. Yeah, so this is a dead draw, and Magnus is going to pull it off. I think Nepo is finding it hard to recover after that previous game, and I don't blame him. That was a very, very good chance for him. But all credit to Magnus. So let's go back to Hikaru against So. I think that's the interesting game right now. Okay. Actually, the more I look at this position, the more I realize it's hard for Wesley to make progress here. Because again, the C file is closed. White would like his own pawn to disappear. Imagine if you could take the pawn on C6. Then White would have, again, a direct line of fire to Black's king via C7. But as it stands, Hikaru could just do nothing. And I don't see a good way for Wesley to make progress. Remember, if you try to activate this bishop, the moment you do that, Hikaru is going to shift his queen to H8. That bishop's going to have to go right back in order to keep the H1 square covered. Rook to A8 by Hikaru. He's just attacking the queen. The issue is, and Wesley doesn't mind a draw at all because he will win the mini-match, Hikaru needs to win this game, and that is going to be a big problem. I just don't see a single way that he can even attempt to generate chances in this position. And that's the main issue here. Wesley can modify his strategy because a draw suits him completely. Okay. Yeah. So it's very locked. I don't see any chances realistically for Black. Wesley is dipping a little bit on the clock. But this is the kind of position you could play fast. Okay. Anybody have any questions about this position or the games? I'm happy to also answer them. I'm not trying to just make this a one-way street. Bishop e4 would be too much, right? You would be giving up your bishop, and in return you would be getting sort of an intangible benefit, right? You'd be getting a rank for the rook, but that wouldn't be enough to justify such a sacrifice. If I were Hikaru trying to win, I mean, maybe you could try rook a2, just something provocative. Like, the way that these positions can sometimes be won is you provoke the opponent into something overambitious, right? Wesley thinks, now I can win, and he makes a misjudgment. So I would play provocatively if I were Hikaru, but it's easier said than done, because rook a2 that doesn't even do much, right? It just sits there. And you could also chase the rook away. You could go rook to c2 and offer the trade of rooks, which is totally fine for white. But I would do something in that spirit. The other thing I would consider doing if I were Hikaru is try to triple on the d file. So maybe queen to g5, and then rook h8 and queen h5. Now, we discussed that even in this situation, Wesley could evacuate his king at a moment's notice. But if he does that, then you could put a rook on h2. And so I would probably try to do that instead. Yeah, I would go queen f6 or queen g5, try to get the rook over to h8. That might involve giving up the c7 pawn. That's the issue. But so be it. I mean, again, you have nothing to lose here. A loss is literally equivalent to a draw. Babla, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you just called this idea. Yeah, so that's, well, you do have bishop e4, but that might be part of what I mentioned, right? Maybe you give this pawn up and buy yourself some time. Because, remember, this bishop is vulnerable, and it's the key to the defense of white's king. Okay. So we'll see what Hikaru does. He's definitely thinking about all these ideas. He's thinking about how to make them work. He's got really only one shot. Oh, queen f3 is also an idea, by the way. And a win to Remix, you're mentioning a very, very beautiful concept, which actually happened in one of my old games. So let's, if you put on the board this, you can go queen to f3, and by virtue of the x-ray, you win, because the bishop has to take the queen, and there's now no stopping the checkmate. Very nice call. So that's another thing that Hikaru could consider. Queen f6, followed by rook a to h8. That's a really cool tactic. And the funny thing is, I had a game a couple of years ago, which I've shown on stream in a lesson with Nicola, where I had exactly the same idea in that game. And I'll just show you guys really, really quickly while Hikaru was contemplating his move. So I had the following position. Okay, I had the following position in one of my games against Friedel. And here I played queen f3. And if he would have snuck his bishop on g7, I had this idea of going queen to f6. Exactly the same concept, right? Sacrificing your queen to establish a pawn on f6 and to eliminate a defender of the h8 square. Now, it's a different execution here. There, you're putting a rook on h8. Here, I'm putting a pawn on h8. But you can see that the patterns, the tactical patterns, are often shared between several different kinds of attacks. And that's always a good thing to notice when you're trying to learn and you're trying to pick up on ideas. So that's one thing to point out here. Hikaru continuing to contemplate his options as Nepo and Carlson continue to play. Thank you, Text Chess. Appreciate it. 12 months, my man. Well, thank you, iFisher. Really appreciate it. Thank you. That's very sweet. Okay. Geary is much stronger than me. I, again, think in terms of world rankings. I'm like 150. Geary is like top 5. So I might be stronger in Blitz and Bullet, but that's basically it. That doesn't count for anything. Now let's see what Hikaru does here. He continues to contemplate this critical moment. We're anticipating queen f6. I don't think he's going to be able to resist this idea. Wesley will see the idea of queen f3. Another thing to point out here is that queen f6 might meet with queen b7, right? A fork against the rook and the pawn. And if you stubbornly pursue this idea, this doesn't work anymore. And there's a very interesting reason why. Could somebody tell me why in this position black no longer has imminent checkmate on h8? What defensive resource does white now have in this position? And think about what the mechanism is behind this checkmate. You could go queen e5, and you could just take the rook, and black's attack has been disrobed. There's rook h1, and it's no longer a threat, and white just promotes his pawn. Good job. Hikaru has gone rook a6. After much contemplation, he's decided not to embark on that idea, which surprises me. But I guess there was something about it that he didn't like. I guess he just couldn't make it work in his mind. And remember that Wesley is not someone who falls for any kind of superficial tactical ideas. So a realistic decision by Hikaru, maybe another strategy that he might be adhering to. Hear me out for a second. Hikaru might be saying this, okay, Wesley has no easy way to make progress. So what he's going to do is try to bleed Wesley's clock until he's got 2 or 3 minutes. And then he's going to all of a sudden re-embark on that plan. So he might be trying to bank on Wesley getting nervous and thinking for a long, overthinking things, trying to manage his position. You can already see that it's bearing some fruit, but it could backfire because Wesley could find a way to trade a bunch of pieces, and that's exactly what he's done here. He's sacrificing his pawn back, but in return, he's trading rooks and he's opening the c-file, both of which are benefiting him. Again, let us not forget, he's trying to make a draw. What I'm not sure about, he can go even rook c5 immediately. In fact, I think that's what he's going to do. You don't need to give up the c-file at all. And you could now, you have very nice pressure on this pawn, and black has to go all in for passive defense. And that's exactly what Wesley has done. He's gone rook a to c5. I don't think Hikaru can take the rook. I think Hikaru has to go rook b6. He's got to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. But this is exactly what we discussed. Remember I said white wants to take his own pawn? Well, he's gotten black to take his pawn. And now, all of a sudden, and that's what Hikaru has done, but queen a5 or queen c3, and white's got tremendous pressure on the c7 pawn. That's the direct artery we talked about. Rook to b5. Okay, so Wesley instead deciding to trade the rooks, which is just as sensible because he's got another rook remaining on c1. Again, you could have a repetition of moves here. That would be entirely in Wesley's favor because a draw wins him the mini-match. What Hikaru could also try to do is go rook h to c6 because it's all about the c-file here. And if you take and go rook c5, yeah, I don't know. This is just a draw. So This just doesn't look winnable at all for Hikaru. But maybe, I mean, he always finds a way to mix things up, so that's one of his strengths. And he's desperately trying to do that here. Okay. Give me a second. I'm finally allowing myself a cup of coffee today. Yeah, so takes in rook b6, makes sense. We're anticipating queen c5 or queen a5, something like that. Okay. So if Hikaru... Yeah, queen c5, there we go. And what Hikaru might have to do, and that would spell disaster, is c6, and he's done it. And he has no choice. There's no other way to defend the pawn. And why is this disaster? Because now the rook is tied down to the pawn. Wesley could finally, and that's what he does, he can finally liberate his bishop. Why? Because it's the same analogy. Hikaru now can no longer maneuver his pieces to the h-file. Wesley has judged that Hikaru just literally has no way to get his rook to the h-file, so the bishop is home free. You could finally activate it and have it be a working member of society on e2. And you might be looking at this and saying, how does he know that? Well, if you just look at the rook on b6, how is it going to ever get to the h-file in a timely manner? It's not. Right? It's going to have to go to b8, but if it goes to b8, then you drop c6. And if you drop c6, then white's pieces stream in via the c-file. So a very, very subtle approach to the position by Wesley, and I think this is going to yield the benefit of the draw. Again, if he was playing a classical game here, just in an individual tournament, he would be playing this for a win, but as it stands, he has the benefit of the draw. So, yeah, this is going to be very, very hard for Hikaru to create any realistic chances in. Okay. I was never in this tournament. And I wanted to thank everybody. We have over 1,000 people, once again, for joining the commentary this morning. I appreciate it. We're over 4,000 subs, which is amazing. We hit that yesterday for the first time in my streaming career. So in the spirit of Thanksgiving, I'm extremely grateful for this community and to everybody for all of your sweet messages and all of your support. So thanks, everybody, and hope you're enjoying. Thank you, Big Evo, for the 100 bits. Yeah, so bishop e8 to untie the rook was suggested, but then I can go bishop e2 and attack the pawn. So you're not going... It's all pawns and no talk. All talk and no pawns. What's Benoit say about the Caro-Kann? Is it all pawns and no something? I forget what it is. Maybe somebody... all pawns and no hope. No hope. No hope, yeah. All pawns and no hope. So this is all pawns and no hope. And yeah, there's very little hope remaining of a draw for Hikaru. Sorry, of a win for Hikaru. And yeah, it's probably going to be a draw. Now, checking quickly back to Jan against Carlsen. I mean, if anybody can win this position, it seems to be Magnus. You could, I mean, this is just, Magnus is not going to lose this. You could even take and go king d6 and just walk the king over. Because rook g7 could be met with rook to g8. And you just have a dead draw. Let me refresh again so the clocks start ticking. I think he was talking about the Caro-Kann, though, to be honest. Okay, rook. That's exactly what he's done. I think he's going to go king d6. And we're going to see a draw in this game. Magnus wins the first mini-match, putting Nepo in a must-win situation for tomorrow's mini-match. All right, which I will try to commentate. We will see. I don't know if I will manage to do so, but we will see if I can get at least 1 or 2 hours in. I've got some of my family coming over tomorrow for the day, so I'll have to be free the second half of the day. Well, my brother and I've got some couple people coming over. You'll commentate? Well, I don't know about that. Then I might have to commentate. If Hess is going to take over, man, I don't know about that. What book am I... No, I'm not reading any book. I'm flipping absentmindedly through the pages of a book called The Path to Chess Mastery. It's a Soviet book from 1970. Nakamura has drawn, yes. So, all right. So we had a draw. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong game. Yeah, they've agreed to a draw because... And people might be wondering, why did Hikaru offer a draw here? You know, it's because he has no chances of winning this game. None. You know, there's just no way. And he's got not a single idea. And so he acquiesced to that and offered a draw. which makes perfect sense. So he loses the first mini match, as he did against MBL, which puts him in a must-win situation for tomorrow. And that means that, well, he's surmounted this before, but Wesley's got to be happy with the result of this, and Nepo Carlsen also draw, so both games end at the same time. And Magnus wins their first mini match, which puts Nepo in a must-win scenario. A tall order for both of them, but, you know, that's what makes this tournament fun. Everybody's capable of anything.